Hey everybody, I hope y'all having a fantastic week so far. As we continue our lessons and we continue through the book of Joshua, we are going to look today at the moment that the nation of Israel had been waiting for since they left and since before they left Egypt. This was they were going to go in and take the promised land and actually enter into the promised land. Now, of course, there were several things that delayed that along the way. They probably wouldn't have taken them so long to get there had they listened and trusted and obeyed in God. But yet here we are, 40 years from the moment, about 40 years from the moment they believed the bad report from the spies. They're finally entering into the Jordan. So all these children that their parents have been telling them about this, it's finally that moment for them to cross Jordan, to go in, to take the land that God has been promising them since forever, since Abraham. God had been promising them this land. And so today we're going to be actually looking at two chapters. We're going to be looking at Joshua 3 to 4. This is the story of them crossing the Jordan. Now we're not going to read all the verses because that would be a lot, and it's about 40-some verses. But we're going to be reading a couple verses here, a couple verses here, a couple verses there to kind of get the idea about what's going on, to see what's happening, what's going on, and just what we can do and take and apply to our lives today. So to begin with, we're going to be reading from Joshua chapter 3, and we're going to be reading verses 1 through 6. Verses 1 to 6 of chapter 3. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim. And they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, your God, being carried by the Levitical priest, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass before the people. So they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went before the people. And so what we see here is it's very interesting as we see this. They're preparing and getting ready to cross the Jordan River and go into the promised land. So Joshua sits there and he tells the nation to prepare. He tells them to prepare, and then he tells them what to look out for. They were getting prepared to cross the Jordan. They had all their stuff ready, their weapons, their tents, all that stuff. They were ready. All they had to do was pay attention to the ark. Pay attention to the ark and pay attention to God's leading. They were supposed to watch for when the ark moved. They were supposed to pay close attention, to listen, to hear, to see the ark. And once they saw that moving, once they saw that started going, then they were to follow it. And there's a couple really interesting things in this passage. One of them was, it said that they were supposed to keep back, about, 2,000 cubits, I believe it said. 2,000 cubits. Now, cubits isn't something that we typically measure, we typically know or understand. Typically, a cubit was measured from the fingertip to the elbow. And, it ended up being about 18 inches. So they were told to keep 2,000 cubits away. Well, that's about 1,000 yards, so about 3,000 feet away from the ark. That's an interesting command. That's an interesting thing to think about. Well, why were they supposed to keep that far away? I think what it does is it speaks to that, they're supposed to respect God and respect God's holiness and be fearful of God as in a good way, fear God and what he can do. Because they had seen him do some great things. They had seen him give them victories over the enemies that they probably were not as equipped or prepared for to go against already. He had seen them wipe out the nation of Egypt, the army of Egypt in the Red Sea. They had seen so many different things that God had done. But yet they had a fear of him. They didn't fear God like, we think of fear. It was fear like they had a reverence and a respect for that. And that's what this is about right here. It's having a proper reverence and respect for the things of God. There are several reasons, as it said, they didn't know where to go. right? So they needed to follow it. They need to follow the ark because it was kind of like a GPS. Think about GPS today. If we go anywhere that we've never been before, what do? Well, we pull out our phones, open up our map app, whether it's on Apple or Android or whatever you have, and we navigate to it through GPS, through satellites. Well, this is what this was. They had never been this way before. They were unfamiliar with this territory. They were unfamiliar with the land. They didn't know where to go and where God was going to lead them, but they had to follow to pay attention to that. They had to follow the ark. They hadn't been there before. So they had to look to the ark, just as they had looked to the cloud that they had to follow in the desert by day and the fire by night that God had taught that we learned about and studied a little bit earlier. They had to follow the ark to know where to go, to know where to direct them, to pay attention to what God was doing and where God was leading them. The next thing we're going to look at and we're going to see is that we're going to talk about stepping out in faith. Stepping out in faith. I kind of mentioned this briefly last week when we were talking about Rahab and stepping out in faith. But we're going to see, and putting actions to some of our faith, right? And so we're going to look and see in this next part, we're going to see in verses 14 to 17, the people come to the Jordan and how they walk across the Jordan. And so we see in verse 14, so when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priest, pass over the Jordan with the priest, bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people. And as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priest bearing the Ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarthan, and those flowing downward towards the Sea of Arabia, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite of Jericho. Now the priest bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, all Israel passing over on dry ground until the nation finished passing over the Jordan. Once again, this is a very interesting passage and something that we really can look at and see and apply to our lives today. We see here that they were getting ready to pass over the Jordan. So the Ark of the Covenant God was directing the priests where to go, exactly where to go and what to do. This isn't the first time that the nation of Israel had seen God do miraculous things when it comes to water. We saw back earlier last year in our study, and also when we did our recap from going to Egypt to the Promised Land, we saw that God parted the Red Sea so that they walked across on dry ground. We didn't emphasize it as much back in our recap, but let's talk about that for a second, and we're going to talk about this and today. So we see that God parted the Red Sea, God parted the Jordan. Now, as you may know and may not know, one of the interesting things in here is this little parentheses that's around part of the story. And it says that the banks of the Jordan were overflowing because it was at the time of harvest. So as you know, there are times whenever there may be more water, there may be less water. So kind of think of it, maybe the harvest time, there's time whenever it's more rainy, they get more rain in, so the rivers are flowing. We see that around ourselves all the time. I look at there's a pond on 87 right up the street from the church. There's a little gazebo that's in there. And there's times whenever the water in there is right up to the boards where you'd stand on in the gazebo. And you may know what I'm talking about. You may have seen it as you drive by. And then there's other times whenever it's about a foot or two under. And there's no water, that you can't really see the water touching much of even the bottom of the boards that go around. And so, that's kind of like what it is. There are times whenever water and rivers and things like that are more full because there's more rain. Well, that's the time it was right here. It was more rain. So they weren't just, passing a small little piece of the Jordan that was, barely flowing. No, the river was raging. Think about kind of like, like Whitewater Rapids or, or a river that's wide that they had to go across because it's wider, because it's more snowy at this time. And so they had to do this. Now, they had to step out in faith. God told the priests to go and to step into the Jordan. He didn't tell the priests to go and just, that he would part it before they stepped in the Jordan. No, they had to put that action to their faith. They had to have action to the faith. They had to go and step in the Jordan, put their feet in the Jordan River, and then God parted it. God parted it. And not just that, God made the ground dry. I don't know if you've ever been around, and you probably may have, whenever maybe it's in a ditch in your front yard, or you've been around the rivers, on the banks of the river, where it's kind of, receded a little bit. The water, the ground is wet and muddy. And if you step into, a river where there's a lot of mud or dirt or rocks, the rocks are slippery because they're wet. There's mud, so it keeps you, it bogs you down. And if you dry it up and the water stops and gets done, it's still wet and muddy there for a while until it dries out. Well, just like God did with the Red Sea, where he made it dry for them to go across, he does that again in the River Jordan. Now remember, most of the people that were crossing the Jordan more than likely weren't at the Red Sea crossing, or may not remember it, or they may have been babies when they were there. So we got to remember that. And think about that. This is the first time that they've seen maybe God do something this miraculous. But just think about that. It wasn't just that he parted the river for them to go across. He parted, and they walked across on dry ground. It wasn't muddy. It wasn't slippery. It wasn't wet. It was dry. It was safe for them to cross to where they wouldn't get stuck. They wouldn't be impeded. They could get across as fast as possible. As fast as possible. Once again, the priests, they stepped out in faith, believing that God was going to do something. And he did. So, that's what we can do. And we'll look at that a little more later as well. So the next thing we're going to do, the next part is we're going to look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. And we're going to look at here because, this is an interesting passage as well in the story of Joshua, is that they're setting up a memorial to remember what God had done. This really kind of is one of the first times they've done this. They've done it several times along the way, but this is the first memorial they're really setting up in their land to remember what God has done for them. So we're going to read verses 1 through 10. When the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe of man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight." Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God in the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel. That this may be a sign among you, when your children ask in time to come, what do those stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever." And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over to the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where his feet of the priests bearing the ark always stood. And they are there to this day. For the priests bearing the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people passed over in haste. So we really see here a miraculous thing. Once again, whenever miraculous things happen, or things that are major happen in our lives, We memorialize them. Whenever there's someone important in our lives, we memorialize it. Whether it's a funeral or something like that, we remember these things. And we try to remember what things this person and this may have influenced in our lives. We see statues all over the place. You see Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. You go to Washington, D.C., you see all kinds of memorials, all kinds of things. You got the World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Korea War Memorial, all those things, the Iwo Jima statue, all those things are a reminder of things that have happened in the past in this country. They are. Whether it's honoring the past leaders, our founding fathers, because you got the Washington Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, all those things, or whether it's honoring those who have served and remembering those who have served. Being at the Vietnam Memorial, they got the wall there, and it has all the names of everyone who died in the Vietnam War. And that's a reminder of what we've been through and where we've come from. This was the nation of Israel going and setting up a memorial for them, to remember what God had done in their lives, how God had brought them to this. Crossing the Jordan River was an important event in the history of the nation of Israel. Not only was it a miraculous thing that God had done by parting the sea and letting them walk across, parting the river and letting them walk across on dry land, but it also was the first time that as a nation they were going in to conquer the land, to take the land that God had promised that he would give them for hundreds of years before this, and probably maybe even longer. So this was important for us. So they took 12 stones, and as we see throughout the whole entire history of Israel, a lot of times whenever they did things like this, they took a stone, or there was 12 of whatever it was they did, one for each tribe in the nation of Israel. So they took 12 stones. They did it to remind not only themselves, but to remind their children about what God had done. So that as they got older and the people who were actually there may have died out, their children would remember what their parents had told them and tell the next generation and the next generation, the next generation, the next generation. So we see that time and time again, and like I said, we do that here in the United States, and every country does it, where they put up memorials to honor people or a person who may have done something extraordinary in their lives. And then we can tell each other about that despite of what's going on. Most of y'all may not have been alive, whenever September 11th happened. I remember that vividly on that day. I was in college. I remember what I was doing. Just thinking about that reminds me about, what happened on that day. And so that's what these stones were. They were to remind people about what happened. All these memorials that we have up remind people about what happened and what may have happened in history, so that we can learn from our history and maybe learn from our mistakes. So we come down to the point where how do we apply this story in Joshua to our lives today? How do we apply it? Well, the first thing is whenever we were looking and they were preparing and they were supposed to watch out for the Jordan, they were looking for that opportunity. They were looking for the ark to move. They were sensitive to when the ark, they knew it was coming. They knew what God wanted them to do, but they just had to pay attention for the moment God wanted them to do that. Well, in the same way, that's the way we are in our lives. We have to be paying attention and be in a close walk with God so that we can be sensitive to what he has for us. They had to be sensitive when the ark moved, because whenever the ark started moving, they had to get going. It was time. It was time for them to start moving, to go into the land. They had to be paying attention. We need to be paying attention in our lives for what God has for us, whether that's witnessing to someone else or, what God may have for us in the future. Maybe it's a career. Maybe, God wants you to do something. Be paying attention. Having a close relationship with him is the best way to do that. Second, we look at the second part of the story we looked at, where the priest came and touched the sword. Sometimes we have to step out in faith. We have to put some action behind our faith so that we can be blessed by God. God didn't need the feet of the priest to touch the water before he could part it. He didn't need that. But he wanted some faith on their part to prove that they were sensitive, to prove that they trusted in him to do that. And that's what happened. And then the last thing, which we're going to dwell here for a second, is thinking about the memorials, thinking about those times in our lives. What memorials can we set up or should we set up to remember the faithfulness of God? The nation of Israel, they took the stones out of the Jordan. I have a stone here. I just grabbed it from out of the back door. If I were to set up a memorial for everything that God had done for me, I would think back to the time whenever I had one summer. It was beginning of the summer in June. I had to have an emergency appendectomy. I had to get my appendix taken out. All of a sudden one Sunday afternoon. And not just that, but there were complications that came with that. That's one of the most common surgeries that surgeons do. But yet, there's complications whenever I did that. I ended up getting a blood clot that went to my lung. I was in the hospital for 15 days in the month of June. God was faithful. He brought me through it. Titus at that point was only 6 months old. 5-6 months old. He brought me through it. He brought me through that. I think about the time that another stone that I saw God was faithful in my life was when Holly had a miscarriage. We had a miscarriage. We were excited. We were ready. We went there, and it was just heartbreaking. I saw God work mightily in our lives. And now, I saw God work through some health issues that I had. We went to the doctors, and He was faithful to give us another child. And that's why we have Hannah Joy. He blessed us with Hannah Joy. And so we see these times where God's faithful in our lives. And times whenever, I can think back to even times whenever I was in college, whenever I was struggling. I didn't have any money to buy anything. I randomly got $100 one time from somebody. Whenever I was in the Philippines for 8 weeks, I got to see many different things and see God work mightily and keep me safe whenever I was going to areas that were more Muslim controlled and risk of being kidnapped was higher. I saw God be faithful in so many different ways. And that's what we should do as Christians is be telling our kids about those times that God's faithful. Create memorials that we can tell others about God's faithfulness in our life, because it's also not just for tell others, but to remind ourselves, because there's going to be times in our lives when we're going to struggle. Maybe we're dealing with a family member who has cancer, the death of a grandparent, loved one, death of your parents, going through a rough situation with a divorce or something else. You can look back at the times where God was faithful and say, God was faithful in that. Whenever I was struggling, whenever I was going through that, He's going to be faithful in that. Set up these memorials in your mind now, so that as you grow up, get married, have children of your own, you can remind them about the faithfulness of God in your life. And so as we go out this week, let's just try to think of ways of how God's been faithful in our lives. Yes, you may not have gone through a lot of rough situations. You may not have dealt with a lot of major health issues. You may not have dealt with death. You may not have dealt with those things in your life. But yet, be looking for ways that God has done that and remember those. Ways that God has worked in your life. And whenever tough times come your way, think back on those things to remember how faithful God was there and how He's always faithful no matter what. Yes, we go through struggles. Yes, we go through hard times. But yet, God is still there to be alongside, to cast our burdens on. And we can always depend on Him. We just have to remember how faithful He's been to us.